crowd on an autumn day, glorious autumn day. Huge number, that's terrific. I am not sure if I'm supposed to use this microphone. I guess this works, so I'm going to turn off the cool one that they've given me. The topic that we are lucky enough to be exploring today is sometimes called digital democracy. It is something very old and something very new. The old part, democracy, and the origins of what some people are calling a revolution in the Middle East. We're talking about citizens and their voices and their governments and how things change. That's the old part. The new part, social media, which relies on computer chips and the internet to send information around the world at breakneck speed. Words and pictures, and especially evocative, video, as well as ways of connecting people who might not have been connected very easily before. We're going to talk about each of those things. When you think about the power of the internet and social media, now of course not all social media is the internet, it's also connected, we're connected by phones, dumb phones and smartphones. But when you think about that power, think about the scenes we saw from Tahrir Square in Cairo earlier this year, how remarkable those were. Think too about other memorable scenes. Think about the woman in Iran who was killed by a sniper, Neda. You may remember her from 2009. She became a symbol of oppression and in some ways a symbol too of possibility, both of the technology and of what a difference people can make when they get together. Think in a funny way of the regular guy in Abbottabad, Pakistan, who's up working late earlier this year, and he hears a ruckus and he hears some explosions and he sends out a tweet, and it turns out he's tweeting the attack on Osama Bin Laden. I teach a course at Northwestern on foreign policy, and I was talking about the Vietnam War and the secret bombing of Cambodia and how it was secret for 14 months. In this day and age, you couldn't have a secret bombing of Cambodia. We are so wired. Think about, of course, the capture and killing of Muammar Gaddafi just a few days ago. The final minutes of a dictator caught on a dozen or several dozen cell phone cameras and relayed as fast as lightning to our telephones, our televisions, our computers, our iPads. It really is quite amazing when you think about it. Now let's talk a little bit about social media itself. Now I know every one of you in the audience has your own Twitter feed, right? Twitter, you got your own Facebook pages, you're all wired and ready to go. Actually, just curious, who has a Facebook page? Very significant number. Who has a Twitter feed? Are there a few? Who follows a Twitter feed? So we're going to talk a little bit about how some of this works, because believe me, I didn't know very much about this stuff very long ago. We have experts who do this practically for a living. But think about it another way. How many of you turn to the internet, either on your home computer, an iPad, an iPhone, a smartphone, for news, for a significant part of your news? Right, so those numbers are growing, and they will grow even more as time goes on. Now, who of you just depends on your average 10-year-old kid to tell you everything you need to know about how to work these things? There's a lot of us out there who do that too. So it may be baffling. I mean, in some ways, it really is almost like another language. I mean, I know I remember giggling when I heard that a Twitter feed leads to tweets, and then if you send it to somebody else, it's retweeting. Try saying that 10 times in a row. Or the fact that if you are sending tweets on your Twitter feed, you are a tweep. So it's hard sometimes to take this seriously, but it is a remarkable new technology. It truly is a brave new world. The influence of technology on politics and democracy is profound, and I think its potential for holding authoritarian governments accountable and giving voice to citizens is sometimes romanticized and yet has real meaning that, again, we're going to get into it in some detail. Some people call it liberation technology, kind of a play on the old notion of Catholic liberation theology. Of course, some people consider computer technology like a religion, but that's another story. Technology has its possibilities, it has its limits, but I think its influence on the political and social discourse is undeniable. And today we're fortunate to talk about one particular example. of the role that social media is playing in the Arab world, where this year has seen change and tumult unlike any period in the region in recent times. Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Bahrain, Syria. Our panelists have been there. They have seen what's gone on. We've been privileged enough to follow it at a distance. There have been wins as well as losses, results that will only become clear over months or years. By many accounts, the beginnings of the Arab Spring took place in a small town outside of Tunis in Tunisia, when a fruit seller in December named Mohamed Bouazizi became very frustrated at his treatment by a couple of members of the police who gave him trouble one day. He became more and more frustrated, and he felt mistreated. He felt that things were not going very well for him, and that it was somehow fundamentally unfair, and that he had no voice. And his friends heard him say that very day, December 17th, "Why are you doing this to me? I'm a simple worker. I just want to work." To the horror of his friends and family, he set himself on fire. Now, he lived, at least for a few weeks, and he went to a hospital. The next day, some of his friends got together and protested outside the city hall in this small town. That itself was fairly dramatic, and a cousin of his, with a cell phone, took a video of that very small protest. And this is how social media works. The cousin posted the little video on the web. A blogger in Tunis, an anti-government blogger who thought things all was not right in Tunisia, posted it on Facebook. On Facebook, it was seen by many people who care about these issues, including Al-Jazeera. Within hours, Al-Jazeera broadcast the scene of that protest in Tunisia, and the rest, as they say, is history. And as we will hear from Abdul Rahim, Al-Jazeera, which in some ways is new technology, in some ways it's an old technology, right? But satellite TV in the Arab world has become hugely important, played an essential role, but in each case in many cases drawing on these reports from citizen journalists. The case of the Bouazizi video is instructive because it showed that citizens using technology could break the government's monopoly of information. Think about the Soviet Union, think about China in the old days. Governments, authoritarian governments, have a monopoly of information. If citizens don't know things, or they don't share, certain experiences about what's going on, it's a lot harder to act. And it's very long been true that authoritarian governments, by controlling information, often try hard and have some success in controlling their populations. In the case of Mohamed Bouazizi's case, those events, it would be 12 days before the Tunisian state television even acknowledged what was going on, but by then it was too late. Everybody already knew. This is the power of social media in one sense. Those protests soon erupted in Tahrir Square, overthrew governments, captivated a region and much of the world. Words and images from those protests ricocheted through cyberspace all but instantly, showing the power of computers and cell phones and citizen activism alike. In the next hour or 90 minutes or so, we will have a chance to explore what happened and what it may mean for people and governments in the Middle East and North Africa, and I think what social media and computer technology could mean for the cause of democracy in general. With me today are three journalists who had particularly intriguing vantage points on events then and now. You may notice that Rania Al Malki, who was hoping to be with us, to join us from Cairo, is not here. She's a talented young editor in Cairo, but events in Cairo forced her to be in Egypt this weekend and not with us. She's very disappointed. But we are really lucky because we have in her place Nadim Houry, who was a very talented and thoughtful young journalist who has been on the scene this year and in years past for the New York Times. So I'd like to start with Abdul Rahim Fukara, who comes to us today from Washington, where he is the Washington bureau chief of Al Jazeera television. The station's rapid rise, its popularity, is easily one of the most important contributors to events in the Middle East this year or any year. Based in Qatar, first came Al-Jazeera Arabic, demonized by the Bush administration, you may remember. The Bush administration felt the station was little more than a platform for anti-American views. That view has changed, and times have changed. There is now Al Jazeera English, started in, if I'm not mistaken, 2006, 5 years ago, as a competitor to the BBC and to CNN International around the world, but especially important as the first truly pan-Arab television news station. You can now watch it in New York, and actually you can now, in recent days, watch it in Chicago, and I actually urge you to do so, because it's got some very powerful reports. Its coverage of the Arab democracy movement has been riveting and essential. And how important was it really? Hillary Rodham Clinton had something to say about that. Here's what she said this year as Al Jazeera broadcast exclusive extra exclusive from the Middle East. She said, Al Jazeera is, quote, literally changing people's minds and attitudes. In fact, viewership of Al Jazeera is going up in the United States because it's real news. You may not agree with it, but you feel like you're getting real news around the clock instead of a million commercials and, arguments between talking heads and the kind of stuff that we do on our news, which, is not particularly informative to us, let alone foreigners, and we know who she's talking about. She's talking about cable news. And probably all cable news, she might have some particular demons out there, though I won't name any names. But the point being, and I think this was true of real experts who were watching Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera had stuff on its airwaves that people needed to know and otherwise didn't. So I'm going to start with Abdul Rahim and ask how Al Jazeera saw its role during the Arab Spring, and where did social media fit into that? And if you haven't, please turn on your mics.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. And it's obviously great to be here, and I hope you'll allow me a quick prelude before I answer your question. I certainly consider it an amazing privilege for me as an Arab journalist living in the United States at this particular point in human history, and I hope you don't find the expression too pompous, but I do consider it a privilege to be living here at this particular point in human history, because human history has always tied the destinies of people in different parts of the world together. But what we are seeing currently has actually taken that to a new level. I mean, if you think back to the past, I certainly think back to the time when Arabs and Muslims translated the Greeks, translated Greek science and Greek philosophy, and on the basis of that, at least in the eyes of many of them, the Europeans built their Renaissance. And by the same token, if you think about some of the American inventions, Facebook and Twitter, and the role that they have actually played in the so-called Arab Spring, I think it's another amazing example of how the destinies of people in that part of the world and people in this part of the world are tied together. And then to take it another notch, just think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, whatever your feelings may be about it, and how a lot of people actually participating in those protests in New York and around the United States, how many of them are saying that they were actually inspired by what happened in Cairo and in other parts of the Arab world. So we obviously live in a very globalized, in a small but very globalized village. Now, to the story of Al Jazeera, and as you rightly pointed out, there's been a major shift in attitude to Al Jazeera in this country, certainly at the level of the administration. I think the shift has been so dramatic that, if Bob Dylan was talking about the times are changing, his head would probably be spinning at the kind of shift that's happened. I was actually, in addition to what you said about Hillary Clinton, I was part of the Al Jazeera Forum at the Museum in Washington, D.C. in May, and our two keynote speakers were, believe it or not, Nancy Pelosi and John McCain. And they had nothing but praise for the role that Al-Jazeera played in covering this new language that the Arabs seem now to be developing in common with the Americans, which is the language of democracy and freedom. Although I tend to get a little bit too skittish when politicians start praising news outlets, but that's a different story. The issue of the marriage between satellite television and new technology. Obviously, it has to be seen in the context of how the media scene in the Arab world has developed over the last 15, 20 years, particularly the last 15 years since the inception of Al-Jazeera. Up until that point, the mid-1990s, you had the media narrative completely dominated by the governments in the region. So basically, people in the region heard what the governments wanted them to hear and nothing else. And then there was a proliferation of new satellite stations such as Al-Jazeera, which gave people in the region, people of various political stripes, a platform to actually weave a different narrative that does not necessarily subscribe to the official narrative of any particular government in any particular Arab country. And what we have seen over the last 15 years on satellite television, we have seen a lot of debate about democracy, about corruption, about the role of women, about the role of religion in Muslim societies, all the things that had not been talked about for many decades before. And I think the effect of that debate, the effect of that narrative has been cumulative, so that by the time you get the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, I think the conditions were ripe, not because satellite television made them ripe, but because satellite television drew attention to them, because the conditions in a place like Tunisia, just to make it a little bit more concrete, Ben Ali, the former president who fled a few months ago and went to Saudi Arabia, what he had been telling Tunisians for over 2 decades, he ruled for 23 years, he'd been telling them, look, here's the deal. I give you a good standard of living, and you give me your political freedoms. And what the case of Bouazizi did was to actually expose the truth that a lot of Tunisians knew, but us outside Tunisia did not know, which is that despite that narrative, there was widespread crushing poverty in various places of Tunisia, such as in Sidi Bouzid, where Bouazizi originated from. And the fact was that Ben Ali turned out didn't offer the Tunisians neither a good standard of living, approximating the standard of living in Belgium, as he was very fond of saying, nor political freedoms. And once the spark happened with Bouazizi setting fire to himself, obviously that unleashed forces across North Africa and the Middle East. And the amazing thing is that what happened after Bouazizi certainly found genuine echoes in almost every Arab country in the region, because the conditions were very similar. You may have the degree of poverty or the degree of repression may have been different, but certainly there were echoes in every Arab countries. And it's very interesting, we were saying before the panel that on this stage you have 3 Arabs who actually represent 3 geographical areas of the Arab world, and maybe my colleagues here can talk a little bit about the issue of the echo. But I'm from the Maghreb in North Africa, Nadim is from the Levant, and Ahmed is from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia. But the marriage of satellite television and new technology, Twitter and Facebook, has opened a new stage in world's history, but certainly in the history of the Arab region. Because what happened in a place like Egypt, and maybe you can talk about this, Nadim, later on, because you were there. In the case of Egypt, when the Mubarak regime started making it really difficult for the international media, and in particular for Al-Jazeera Arabic, because at the end of the day, it was the Arab news outlets that mattered to him. But when he started hassling them, I mean, in the case of Al-Jazeera, for example, they shut down the bureaus of Al-Jazeera in Cairo. They shut down the satellite frequency for Al-Jazeera, so Al-Jazeera had to tweak and twiddle its satellite frequency to be able to continue to provide coverage to its viewers. They shut down the internet, obviously, and ultimately satellite television relied on Egyptians sending out YouTube pictures, sending out Facebook messages, sending out tweets to actually weave that into the coverage that gave us in North Africa and the Middle East an idea of what was going on in Egypt, that gave you here in the United States an idea of what was going on inside Egypt. Egypt being so pivotal, not just to the Arab world, but also to the interests of the United States in the Middle East. And I'll just conclude by saying that I was absolutely amazed during the coverage of Egypt. I was absolutely amazed the extent to which Americans were connected into the story of Egypt. And I think one of the reasons is that those young people, before the political parties, the Muslim Brotherhood and others, started jumping on the bandwagon, but initially it was those young people who were protesting in Tahrir Square, the kind of language that they were speaking during those peaceful protests is certainly a language that Americans had been in tune with for decades, if not centuries. The language of we want to be politically free. We want to be able to choose. And the kind of echo that found in America, because a lot of Americans were watching Al Jazeera English in particular, including the White House, by the way, because of that, the attitudes towards Al Jazeera, just to go back to your question, started to shift. And the hope is that down the road, even the attitudes of the cable companies in this country would start to shift, because it's really a wonderful opportunity for them as well, not just for the citizenry in the United States. I just have to quickly say that, unfortunately, at that particular point in time when Egypt was happening, the kind of enthusiasm and inspiration got a little dampened because the so-called Arab Spring suddenly stalled in Libya. But maybe that's another issue
I think
that we'll talk about.
We'll certainly talk about the places where media isn't everything, and the electrifying moments and the attitudes and those tweets and feeds and YouTube videos that Abdul Rahim has described weren't enough. But that notion of an echo is so powerful, and in a way that's a great description of how social media works, and of course how things bounce around through cyberspace. And the fact that Al Jazeera existed as a pan-Arab satellite station channel in the Middle East was hugely important at the time. As you describe what individual Egyptians were doing against the grand state, there's sort of that image of Gulliver and the Lilliputians, right? And yet there was just something so human and so personal about the little guys starting to win. I'd like to turn next to Ahmed, who comes to us from Saudi Arabia, where he started a blog now 7 years ago. He's currently working at NPR, where he's on the staff of the social media part of NPR, working with Andy Carvin, who became a pretty important figure in this country during the Arab Spring, because he was sifting through an extraordinary number of tweets and posts to come up with a feed that was followed far, far and wide. Now, you're in DC now, but you started your Saudi Jeans blog more than 7 years ago. And you said when you started that you were just doing it for fun. You were doing it in English because it would help your English. And then it became a very closely followed set of observations about the Saudi kingdom. when the blog turned 6 last year, you wrote something that I'd like to quote here for the audience, because I think it says a lot about what Ahmed is up to, and the possibilities and the patience that are both required in this kind of pro-democracy work. He said this: "I celebrate the 6th anniversary of Saudi Genes today. The blog that I started just for fun has claimed a life of its own and has in many ways become central to my own life. It has been a great journey, like a roller coaster full of ups and downs, turns and twists, joy and fear, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes nice, sometimes nasty, but always, always interesting. Some argue that although I say the goal of this blog is to push for change in Saudi Arabia," drawing a contrast with what we got to see so recently elsewhere, "little has changed in the country, and this has nothing to do with Saudi genes or blogging. That could be true, and I'm okay with it. Changing a nation is too great of an endeavor for a humble blog like mine to meet. But for me, the question is not if blogging has changed or can change Saudi Arabia. The question I keep asking myself is it worth trying? And my answer is absolutely yes. I know that I aim too high. That's just me. I can't settle for less. I want everything. But I don't accept injustice, and I believe that we as a people deserve better." You couldn't ask for a more concise and more powerful and more passionate view of what is possible. And Ahmed has just come from the 3rd meeting of Arab bloggers in Tunis, and I hope he'll talk a little bit about that attitude and this sort of, Lilliputian goal later on. But please tell us a little bit about how you see the purpose of that blog, and how is it that you just figure out what to highlight?
Well, as you said, when I started over 7 years ago, I just started for fun and to practice my English. I never ever thought that this would become anything serious, that people would actually care about it.
But it certainly made you masterful in English. That's clear already.
Well, it helped, obviously. But yeah, I never thought it would be anything serious, and I never thought people would care, actually. When I first started, I was mainly talking about, it was just like a personal diary. I wasn't even thinking that I would ever write about politics or anything serious. But I was surprised that I was getting a lot of emails and comments and questions from people who are really curious about Saudi, about the region, the Middle East in general. And I realized that there was this curiosity and this, people wanted to know more. And obviously, neither the local media in Saudi or the international media was providing enough about us. They
weren't getting below the surface?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while to realize that most of the mainstream media coverage, whether it was local or international to Saudi, was really superficial, and they do not get to really understand us and what are our stories, what are the things that we care about, and what do we want to tell the world about ourselves. And that's when I felt I have something to say about this. I felt there was always something that I wanted to add to a story that I read or something that I heard. And so it was a mixture of news commentary and what was happening, and also part of it just personal. This is what I think, this is how I feel, and these are my dreams, and this is what I'm going with this. And of course, at the time, I was really thinking that this will help push for more freedom, more democracy, more justice in Saudi. And I was young, I was really idealistic and ambitious, and I think that the piece you just read is one of these moments years after that when you realize that maybe I was dreaming too much, maybe I was aiming too high, and maybe I shouldn't be all that ambitious. But last year, when, the point you mentioned, when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire and the revolution started taking place in the region, first Tunisia, and then Egypt, I was like, well, maybe this is it. Maybe it's finally happening. And which brings me to the Arab bloggers meeting, which we just had in Tunisia at the beginning of October. This was the 3rd Arab bloggers meeting. The first 2 Arab bloggers meetings took place in Beirut. And when we met in Beirut in 2008 and 2009, we were like about 70 or 80 bloggers from 20 different Arab countries. We're talking about our own different experiences, where do they intersect, where do they look like, where do they differ from each other, and what we can learn from each other. And we're talking about the future a lot. What could this bring? How could the internet and technology and blogging and social media help to change the region? And, we were thinking about the future, but we were also realistic about it, thinking, okay, we really need to tackle this one step at a time. But in less than a year, everything seems to change overnight. And when we met in Tunisia a few weeks ago, one of my friends came to me and he said, remember when we met in Beirut and everyone thought, who are these crazy 100 bloggers who think they can change the region? Well, it did change. Right. And there is no question in my mind, at least, that social media and blogging played a very important and essential role in bringing this change. Of course, satellite TV like Al-Jazeera played a big role, but I think it wouldn't have happened without the use of internet technology and social media.
That's really great, and it's inspirational. And I want to talk with you and Nadim about that notion of whether it really, is it safe to call these the Twitter and Facebook revolutions, or is that just sort of a romantic, kind of easy notion? I'd like to turn to Nadim and tell you a little bit about him. As Abdul Rahim said, Abdul Rahim grew up in Morocco, and Ahmed grew up in Saudi Arabia, and Nadim grew up between France and Lebanon, and has now recently spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and particularly in Egypt, working for the Times. And now is in Chicago, where he's teaching this year at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. Now, Nadim, you covered Egypt before the Arab Spring, and then this year you traveled to a number of countries, Morocco, I think you were in Lebanon and Bahrain, and Syria, of course. How is it right to call these the Twitter and Facebook revolutions, or is that too simplistic?
I don't know. I mean, I've been asked this question so many times, and I think it's the case for all of us, because it's one of the first things that comes to mind when people from abroad, especially the West, want to talk about this. And I mean, in a way, yes. In the same way that newspapers were instrumental and coffee shops were instrumentals in the 18th and 19th century European revolutions, I think you can certainly say that this was the new newspaper and this was the coffee shop that people in France in the 1789 were. It's the same. It has definitely the same effect. At the same time, I'm a bit uncomfortable about generalizing it. First of all, because it makes for a very easy narrative for us in the West. It's kind of it's the gift we bestowed to the Middle East, and because of that gift, the Arab populations
these are American inventions, and
yeah.
It's really technology and
exactly. So if this is kind of the simple way to look at it, and I think in order to say something productive about that, you have to complexify this narrative a little bit. I also think it's very, it really depends on what country we're talking about. If you're looking at Bahrain, which is a small, very, very small country, less than 1 million people, and which is on average much richer than any other Arab country that had a revolution this year, I think the impact of Twitter and Facebook was enormous. Everybody in Bahrain has a BlackBerry and can afford a BlackBerry, can afford data service. And so in a place like Bahrain, it was, I mean, so profoundly obvious that...
So how do people use it? How are they using their BlackBerries?
Everywhere. I mean, we were going to demonstrations, and the minute the security forces would attack the demonstrators, it would be, everybody would know it, and so it would make the demonstrations bigger rather than smaller because people wanted to work at it, actually looking for these confrontations. On one of the biggest day of the Bahraini uprising, which is now kind of stalled, people noticed that the Pearl Square, that was probably on February the 15th, I think. Pearl Square, which was the place that the Bahraini protesters had decided to occupy, it was basically the information that there was no police on Pearl Square just electrified Twitter. and everybody knew it at the same time, and people started marching towards Pearl Square. So that was a good example. If you look at Egypt, I think it was enormous. But at the same time, you've had very traditional movement, labor unions, political parties that were working on these issues for a long time. I'm thinking of the strikes in Mahalla, for instance, in 2008, which were widely perceived as a failure, but who can also be looked at as kind of a repetition of what happened later. And in these strikes, it was kind of the Facebook people failed, and the labor unions were much better at organizing and at creating these strikes. So, and the second thing about Egypt is I think it would never have happened between the alliance of social media and Al-Jazeera. If it was maybe Ahmed might disagree with me, but the social media crowd is, in a sense, not really self-contained, but it's not the kind of crowd that is sufficient to create a mass movement, like a revolution, not in a country of 80 million people.
Is it your experience that it was largely an elite crowd, more educated crowd? Or the intelligentsia?
It is my experience that on average it's a upper middle class to elite crowd who speaks many languages, who has daily constant access to the internet. And it was certainly instrumental, but I don't think that was enough to bring the kind of crowds that people saw on Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution. You needed something like Al-Jazeera, like the medium of television, like traditional medias were still, I think, still very important and were very instrumental, especially in a place like Egypt.
So a traditional media that was reaching Egyptians who didn't have access to Facebook or Twitter or just needed to be rallied in another way.
Exactly.
More by old-fashioned ways. But Ahmed, you have some other thoughts on that.
Who were illiterate.
Who were illiterate, right.
Who couldn't use Facebook.
Not exactly walking around with their BlackBerry.
Because the level of illiteracy in some parts of the Arab world continues to be staggeringly high. So the visual narrative does not need you necessarily to be able to read and write.
I don't know, in the social media circles where I'm working right now, we've been having this debate for a few months now since the revolution started, which is how much of a role did social media play in the whole thing and how essential it was for the uprising movements in these different countries to happen. And as I told you before, there seems to be two big crowds or two big arguments here. One argument is led by people like Malcolm Gladwell, who writes for the New Yorker magazine, saying social media was not all that important and that these revolutions would have happened anyway because the underlying reasons that led to these revolutions, like the youth bulge and high unemployment and poverty and the lack of democracy and freedoms, they are the real reasons behind these revolutions, and that's what makes people decide to rise. But on the other hand, you have people who say, no, this would not have happened without the new technologies, because these very same reasons that Gladwell was talking about, poverty and high unemployment, have existed for decades now. And it wasn't until now when people have the technology that allow them to organize and come together and decide a collective action that help them to bring these governments down. And I find myself, of course, tending to be on that crowd. I think the role of social media is essential, but it's a debate that is still going on, that is still happening. Of course, the role of mainstream media like Al-Jazeera was important, but if we're just talking about the role of social media, I think it's a debate that we're still having, and we'll probably still be having for a while, over who's using them and who's following them, and are they an elite crowd or not. These are all questions that are still contested and debated. And I think, you can say probably that it was an elite crowd that was using these technologies, but that doesn't mean that this elite crowd was not communicating in other ways with the labor unions or other forces in society. So, social media do not actually work in isolation from all the other factors.
I don't know to what extent you would agree or disagree with me, but sometimes I think that the real surprise is not that these protests actually, these revolutions, so-called revolutions, actually happened when they did. The real surprise is that they hadn't actually happened before, because the conditions over at least 4 decades, certainly in the case of Egypt, if you speak to a lot of Egyptians, they say that the decline of Egypt started in the 70s. The deterioration of the economic conditions of a lot of Egyptians started. The beginning was in the 70s. Why was it that even more than a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Arab world had almost given up hope that that change would actually ever come to it? So my theory is that what's happened in the Arab world, regardless of whether it's Egypt or Bahrain or elsewhere, could not have happened the way it did at the time it did, the way it did and at the time it did, because the reasons, as Ahmed said, the reasons are economic, unemployment, and so on. But the timing and the fashion in which they happened would not have happened without the marriage of social media and conventional media such as satellite television. But if you'll allow me, there's just one really crucial, very important factor that we hardly ever talk about. We talked about it a lot at the time in Tunisia, but we talk about it less and less. And that is the smashing of the fear factor. It's just once Tunisians got to a point when they realized that the Ben Ali regime, which had ruled the country with an iron fist, was actually a sort of paper tiger. I remember that several days, just a few days actually before he fled, he gave this speech. And it was obvious from his speech, so he was saying all the things that you're complaining, that you're worried about, that, I would hand down power to a relative. I promise you that's not going to happen. You're worried that I'm going to run for another term in office. I promise you that's not. It had become clear to a lot of Tunisians that this is actually a paper tiger. We can do it. We can bring it down. And at that time, I remember we were all watching Egypt. What are the Egyptians doing? And it was obvious that the Egyptians were gearing up, as they watched Tunisia, they were gearing up to smash their own fear factor. And once the fear factor was gone, it was anybody's guess where that thing was going to go.
Yeah, so it was sort of a Wizard of Oz-like moment, sort of pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Okay. And suddenly, it seemed possible.
Or behind the cage, in the case of Mubarak.
Well, right.
Yeah, one quick point. We keep talking about how sudden and surprising this happened and how nobody saw that coming and we did not expect it. Despite the fact that, as you said, all the reasons have existed for years, it did not happen overnight. Right. Like, especially when it comes to the role of like technology and social media. I started my blog 7 years ago. Bloggers in Egypt and Tunisia have been working for 7 and 10 years. Al-Jazeera started 15 years ago. So it has been building up. It did not really happen just overnight. It did not happen in the past few months. Mm-hmm. It's been building up for years now. And it's been something that we've been talking about, debating, thinking about, dreaming of. And it finally, culminated in this moment. But it did not happen overnight. This has been happening for a while.
In Egypt, we knew when it started, we knew that was the end of the regime. In Tunisia, in the specific case of Al-Jazeera, up until a few days before Ben Ali fled, we didn't know that it was a revolution. We thought that it was just social unrest, the kind of which Ben Ali had dealt with before in his rule. And we all thought, okay, how many people is he going to kill before, things go back to sort of normal? But obviously that didn't happen. So nobody had anticipated that Tunisia would go, but almost everybody had anticipated that Egypt would go.
It certainly seems as though one thread of this is that getting back to sort of Abdul Rahim's notion of this echo, report of this echo, that there are people in each of these countries, countless people in each of these countries, who had been thinking these thoughts for a long time, deeply both, frustrated with government, but also distrustful of it, looking for a way out. And I'm dating myself here, but in an earlier life, I covered all of the revolutions in Central Europe, long before Twitter and Facebook and technology and even satellite television. And similarly there were events that happened over a period of a few years, starting with perestroika and glasnost with Gorbachev in 1985 and 86 and 87. And it took until 89 for the dam to break. And when it broke, it really broke. And the wall fell, and Solidarity was in Poland, and Václav Havel and his friends were in what was then Czechoslovakia. And sure enough, when people lost that fear factor and they were out on the streets, they were speaking the language of freedom and democracy and independence. I wonder what role, in terms of the language that you mentioned, Abdul Rahim, that was so exciting, so electrifying to hear, are those ideas spread in ways, were they spread, and I actually can ask each of you this, in the years before on social media in ways that maybe, in conversations that couldn't have happened or wouldn't have happened otherwise? I mean, it's sort of what you're talking about with the bloggers, it sounds a little bit that way.
For a very long time, as Abdul Rahim said, the government got to control the conversation. They controlled the media completely, and even if people had these notions, they would never have the space to actually talk about them. What satellite TV and then the internet brought to the region is this space where citizens can finally, talk about their dreams and discuss these ideas and talk about them and, imagine the future in a way that was not just personal, but also, national and includes everyone in a country. And
kind of connect and feel a sense of solidarity, find
exactly.
others are out there having these same thoughts.
If you have these thoughts and you think you're alone, you're probably not going to be really encouraged to push through with them. But if you know that you're sharing the same ideals, the same dreams, the same things with other people, with many people, then you will be even more encouraged to do that. And we've seen it, changing in soil. Like when the internet first came to the region, many people started, to break that fear and talk about freedom, but they used to do that behind nicknames and pseudonyms because they were too afraid to do it. Now we're seeing that changing. More and more people are doing this with their real names, with their photos out there, and because they know that this is something important. This is something that is not just limited to them. This is a universal idea that all people can subscribe to. So it took them a while to realize this, but now is the time.
I actually, just as an anecdote, I had a Yemeni tell me, a young Yemeni, that he said he hesitated for a while before taken to the street in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. But he said, once I actually did it, he said, once I'd been protesting for 4 days, I just felt that there wasn't any force in the whole world that could make my genie go back into the bottle. And incidentally, I read something about, actually I didn't read, we had a Yemeni woman in an interview on Al-Jazeera, and she was very angry with the regime of the President Ali Abdullah Saleh. And she said, over the last few years, every time we brought about the subject of change, we want change, he waved the specter of Somalia and Afghanistan, telling them, if you want change, Yemen will become like Somalia and Afghanistan. But she said, now that Tunisia has happened, every time he waves the specter of Somalia and Afghanistan, we wave the specter of Tunisia back at him. It was really interesting.
That's a great thought.
I think
Nadim,
one of the things that the blogs, mostly the blogs, but the Twitter arrived and Facebook arrived a bit later, but what bloggers created over the last 10 years in the Middle East was a public sphere in countries where the public space was cancerous and where you can go in a coffee house in Cairo now, people will probably talk about politics, but 5 or 10 years ago, people were still scared in a way. And I think what happened was that when this wall of fear broke, the first thing that happened was that this virtual public sphere became materialized. If you look at Cairo, Tahrir Square, Pearl Square in Bahrain, The early days of Benghazi in Libya, in front of the, I forgot the street, but in front of the Interior Ministry in Tunisia, the first thing that protesters did in every single one of these countries was to create this forum that they had been living in virtually. But that was, and I think it was central to these, this notion of reinvesting the actual public space and using it as in the way that people were using their blogs, actually. I mean, if you were in Tahrir in this summer, everybody had his little soapbox, and people were discussing their ideas, mostly fighting, but discussing too.
And they were doing this on their
They were doing this in public,
in cyberspace. But then they came out, and now they're doing it in public.
And I think that's, for instance, what's missing in a place like Syria. The state, the repression there has been so fierce that they have not been able to create that public space, which was, I think, the big transformative moments of every one of these.
So other conditions, certain conditions have to exist for social media to make the kind of difference that it contributed to elsewhere.
For sure.
And certainly Syria is a pretty depressing example, and Libya in its own way. I mean, essentially, Gaddafi fought, the rebels fought a war against Gaddafi to drive him out. Talk a little bit about Syria and the way bloggers can and can't operate, what they can do and what difference they can't make. Well, you were there some this summer, Nadim, or in the spring, I guess.
In the spring, yeah.
What were you finding?
Well, Syria is, I can only talk about it as a journalist, as like somebody trying to cover it. And when you're not in there, I think that's a good example from a journalist perspective of how if you do not have an alliance between traditional media and social media, it's almost impossible to get the truth out.
If you don't have, what do you need to make that work?
Basically, actual journalists from Al-Jazeera to all form of foreign news outlets have been banned from Damascus since the early days of the uprising, so since probably late March, early April. And a lot of a lot of the events in Syria have been covered from Beirut and Cairo, relying on phone calls to activists and YouTube videos. And it is impossible to cover something as big as the Syrian uprising using YouTube or Twitter or, this is one of the limits of
because
social
it's
media.
so anecdotal, you mean?
You need people on the ground.
Right.
And because both sides are making false claims.
Well, Ahmed, I think maybe you're just about to talk about this, but sort of being based in DC.
Yeah.
You're trying to assess this enormous flow of information coming in from all of these different sources, and you have to decide what's credible, what's worth sending back out, what to believe.
Yeah, I mean, before that, I mean, we talk in general about the uprisings taking place in the region, but we need to remember that they are not all the same. And we talk about a domino effect, yes, to a degree, but not really sometimes, because every country has a unique situation, every country has its own circumstances, so it's sometimes useful to compare, but you have to remember that every country is different on its own way. And one of the main reasons, one of the main ways that Syria is different, for example, from Bahrain has a 90% internet penetration. Almost everybody in the country is online.
Right.
Not so much in Syria, where the infrastructure is very weak, and you don't have the same, the number of people online who are connected and who are active online in Syria is a very small number. But because the Syrian government has banned international journalists from entering the country to cover the uprisings, we had to depend on social media and the internet to try to understand what was happening and to cover the story, and which is the thing that I have been doing mainly for NPR for the past few weeks. What I do in my day-to-day coverage is that I'm watching Twitter feeds and YouTube videos and Facebook pages updated by Syrian activists, some of them in Syria, some of them based in Beirut and other places, and try to get the latest information and verify it using other sources, and then posting these videos and stories on Twitter and on other sites that sometimes we end up using on the NPR radio station or the NPR site. Sometimes we don't, depending on the story. But it's been a challenge to do this, but it's also a new kind of coverage, a new kind of way to approach news reporting for places where the traditional, the mainstream media cannot get inside the country to get the story.
So in practical terms, you're looking at this information, you're looking at images and video and words that are coming at you, and they would have been done by whom? How? I mean, can you draw just a little picture for the audience of someone sitting in Hama doing what?
Well, in each Syrian city, like Hama or Damascus or Aleppo, you have activists who their job is to get the videos and latest information outside of Syria. They're called the local coordination committees, and these local coordination committees, or the LCCs we call them, are also connected to other people and activists outside Syria who make sure that after they get them out of Syria, they can get to the rest of the world. And
so whereas in the past they would have smuggled things out in
in the past you would have to smuggle a videotape or a photo in now everything is happening using the internet. And despite the fact that actually the internet connection and communication has been cut off in most of these cities by the government to prevent this from happening, but activists are using other technologies like satellite phones and satellite modems to get the story out. So despite the very violent crackdown and the government attempts to cut off communication completely, we would still get a huge number of videos and photos coming out of Syria on a daily basis.
Things that could have taken days or weeks to get out and might not have gotten out at all.
Yeah, while now it happens in real time. Like usually I do that on daily basis, and as I come to the office, the first videos from the morning has already started trickling in, and I'll be watching them usually a few minutes after they were recorded and uploaded.
Actually, that raises, if I may, that for us as journalists covering the specific case of Syria, for example, that raises a moral conundrum for us, because what do you do with those pictures? I mean, usually as conventional journalists, we rely on the golden rule, the two sources. In this case, you only have one source. If it's the Lijan, the committees that Ahmed was talking about, okay, they send you these pictures. How do you actually verify those pictures? You have no way of verifying those pictures. Remember that very funny / tragic story about the guy sitting in Scotland?
Queer girl in Damascus.
Right.
Yeah.
And
you might mention that story because it's telling. It's a great example of this.
There was a video posted by this woman in Damascus about what was going on. News outlets, including my own, we actually went with it. Al-Jazeera English picked it up immediately. Turned out that the video was actually, it wasn't a woman, it was a man.
It was a blog.
It was a blog.
Was it a blog?
It was a blog.
But it turned out that the blogger wasn't actually a woman, it was a man. And the man wasn't Syrian, and he wasn't in Syria, he was in Scotland.
So there's some perils to this.
Yeah, I mean...
How do you decide?
Well, here's the thing. Ultimately, this is a story that if you decide to cover it as a journalist, you're going to find all sorts of different ways to cover it. The burden ultimately becomes the burden on the Syrian government, or whatever government is in question, to actually allow people, to allow journalists on the ground so that they see for themselves. If I do get a video out of Syria and they have a problem with it, fine, I can understand that. But because they're not allowing me a way to actually verify that video, I'm going to go with it. It's not the best situation for me, but it solves somewhat my moral dilemma, my obligation to my viewers, to the public, that I have to give them an idea what's going on inside Syria. But you know, this whole so-called Arab Spring is full of amazing, mind-bending dilemmas and ironies. Tunisia and Egypt, for example, both Ben Ali and Mubarak, invested heavily in wiring up Tunisians and Egyptians. Well, guess what? In the end, they used that against them to topple them.
In fact, I think it's true that Tunisia is the most wired country in the
region.
East, or in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a source of pride for him that he'd invested so much money and effort and expertise into actually wiring Tunisians to that extent. And in the end, he suffered the consequences of it. And if I may just point out one more really interesting irony. The people demonstrating in Tunisia or Cairo or other parts of the Arab world, surprisingly enough, there was very little anti-American sentiment. Very, very little, as we all saw. Now, the general narrative that we'd been hearing prior to these revolutions was that there was too much outside interference in the internal affairs of these countries, including by the government of the United States. Now think about this. For all the things that Egyptians, for example, were saying in Tahrir Square, that the people and the army are one during the protests, now there are a lot of questions being raised by Egyptians, at least about the Supreme Military Council, casting doubt over the role that they actually played during the revolution, but certainly over the role that they, Egyptians say, the military want to play in the future of Egypt. The United States, over 30 years, invested heavily in the Egyptian army, almost, what, $2 billion a year? I have to be careful how I say this, but
don't.
It's maybe I shouldn't.
You're on TV.
No, don't be careful.
But it seems to me that for all the patriotic relationship that ties the Egyptian people and their army, it seems to me that without the kind of financial investment that the United States government made into the Egyptian army over 30 years, the Obama administration would not have any leverage over the army to actually put pressure on it to, in turn, push pressure on Mubarak to step down with a minimum amount of blood spilt. Now, if you think about the blood that's being spilt by the army in Syria, the irony is, over 40 years, the West has had very little leverage over what goes on inside Syria.
And if I may, the Egyptian army seems to be starting to be spilling quite a bit of blood.
But now they seem to be spilling quite a bit. The transition may have been much more complicated and messy in Egypt had it not been for the role for the pressure that the Americans, because of the financial aid that they've been given to the Egyptians,
Well, and one of the
As
would have been a lot
Nadim,
messier.
as Nadim is saying, the role is reversing now because the Egyptian army now is acting just like the Mubarak regime, and Egyptian activists are asking the American government to cut the military aid if the army doesn't stop their actions.
Yeah.
Which is a really great segue to one last little thing I'd like to ask you about before we turn to the audience for some questions. And that is the role of the media, social media, and otherwise going forward. I mean, certainly Abdul Rahim's point about the influence that the Obama administration may have been able to exert is quite intriguing. And yet going forward, the Arab Spring has turned into a pretty desultory Arab summer and fall. And so the social media and satellite television that was so absolutely essential to the events so far this year are hard-pressed now to make, to continue with those sort of democratic instincts and progress. So how do you see, in the absence of sort of moments of crisis and protest, the role of social media?
I would start with something a bit counterintuitive, but state TVs in Egypt,
TV.
Syria, Bahrain. I don't know exactly how it works in Tunisia, but they are still very, very, very powerful institutions. And as opposed to bloggers and traditional media, what their reports are not really reality-based, but have a tremendous influence on the populations. I'm thinking about last month, the Egyptian army attacked a Christian rally in front of the state TV building, which the state TV reported as a bunch of Christian activists attacking the army. And that turned into a call for average Egyptians to come defend the army. And around 2 in the morning, Egyptian who had been watching.
That's another irony right there. The army calling on civilians to come and defend it.
Right.
So the people who had been watching state TV showed up to help their army because they're good patriots and started beating Christians. At the end of that night, I think 23 protesters died. 12 of them were run over by army APCs, and the rest were probably killed by people who were basically called on by state TV to go lynch protesters.
And that just sounds so much like revolutions and civil wars and coups in decades past, where the big fight is for control of television and radio. And so where was social media in this?
And I think this
in these moments.
This is the main.
Was there truth-telling though by citizen journalists who were there?
Tons.
And did it matter?
Certainly, but I think there is no. I mean, getting your word out in these moments where tempers are flaming is harder than. I mean, the momentum today in Egypt and certainly in Bahrain and Syria is kind of the states are winning.
Because I guess one of the sort of foundations of the very notion of liberation technology, which is of course a glib term that deserves plenty of deconstruction, is that social media and the internet broadly and the power of computers can hold governments more accountable. Is that likely to happen? Or the record is likely to be mixed?
I certainly think this is the case. I think that the internet and technology are already helping people to challenge their government, as we have seen, and also as we move on, it will help them to keep the government accountable. And we are already seeing projects in different countries on how to use technology moving forward. And in Tunisia and Egypt, we've seen bloggers running in the new elections, for example. So, these online activists who started working just online a few years ago are actually now becoming part of the political process and the change that is taking place in these countries.
That's fascinating.
So, the thing is, it's been almost a year now since Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, and I don't think, despite the fact that Yemen, as someone once said, for every Egypt we have a Yemen, and for every Tunisia we have a Bahrain. But I don't think that this is the end of the Arab Spring, or that these revolutions and uprisings have come to a halt, and we won't see change keep going in the region. I think we're just starting. I think even if you ask the Tunisian and Egyptians today, they will tell you the revolution is not over yet. We're still in the middle of it, and we would still work in that mindset. So I think it's still too early to tell, but it will keep going. These revolutions and change in the region will keep happening in the next.
I totally agree with that. By the way, you mentioned liberation, technology liberation. The language will have to be revisited, like you rightly said, because even the appellation Arab Spring, I mean, first of all, just on a flippant note.
There is no spring.
Not too many, there are a lot of Arabs who only know one season. They don't know because of the climate.
Summer all year long.
But on a more serious note, I mean, we're talking about revolutions, and we're calling this. I think Ahmed is absolutely right. This is just the beginning, or it should be. At least it should be considered just the beginning, because we're talking about revolutions, and how are we describing them? We're describing them as Arab. Part of the big debate in a revolution is that the issues of minorities, for example, issues of minorities in the Arab world is a very, very serious issue. There are a lot of minorities who do not consider themselves Arab. So when you say Arab Spring, are you saying that those minorities are not part of the revolution? Are you saying they shouldn't be part of the revolution? Are you saying that the outcome of the revolution should not extend to them? So, language is very important. And finally, the use of the new technology, I think, is a double-edged sword because, on the one hand, yes, it's allowing people to do young people to bring about all sorts of change possible. But the regimes have also learned, in the case of Syria, for example, Facebook has been used to actually track down bloggers and Facebookers and people and tweeters. More dangerously than that for the long term is that anybody now can say anything on Facebook and Twitter and post it as news. How do you verify? Part of the cacophony in Egypt, let's say about the wealth of Mubarak, there were people putting the wealth of Mubarak at $70 billion. Where the hell is he going to get $70 billion? How do you verify that? So that contributed in a good part of the cacophony of the debate in Egypt. It was now because because you cannot control the messages on new technology. You can't verify them, not control. You can't verify.
I don't think this is such a bad thing. For a region where governments have controlled information flow for a very long time, I don't think it's a huge problem if we have too much freedom where people can say anything they want.
I'm not saying about saying anything they want. I'm saying that people can post wrong information and wrong information which basically masquerades as accurate, right information, and that has ramifications, especially now in the chaotic state of things in a place like Egypt.
And what it shows, and we want to get to some questions from you all, is just the complexity of all of this. And one of the great glories of social media is that there are no filters. One of the problems with social media is there are no filters, right? As Nadim said, in Syria, you need to have people on the ground who are reporting, who are double checking their sources. It's very hard to do all of that sort of all at once. One thing on the, Abdul Rahim is absolutely right about this issue of regimes using the technology to track down people who are their opponents. And it's well known, and this was true in Iran 2 years ago, and it's certainly true in Syria, where the telephone company happens to be owned by Bashar Assad's cousin. Of course, he has records of everybody who has a cell phone and their numbers and so on. So you'd be naive to think that the regime is not going to do everything it can to circumvent that technology, to stop the other side. And the Hillary Clinton State Department is spending tens of millions of dollars on something called circumvention technology, that, internet in a box, the idea that you can train bloggers and citizen journalists to, again, circumvent the system.
Well,
anyway,
one important thing to mention about this before we move to the questions is that you talk about how the State Department is funding these projects to help people get around censorship, but the censorship and surveillance tool that Arab governments use to spy on their people are made by American companies.
Right. Yeah, there's a movement afoot, in fact, to try to stop the sale of that kind of technology to certain governments. As you can see, there are just so many different roads we could take on this, and that's a great irony of this system. Very good point. So who has a question? There are people in the audience who have a microphone, and we have one here.
Can I ask if each of you could offer your thoughts, certainly in what's loosely called the West? There are many models of self-government, and there are many methods of protecting, to a lesser or greater degree, minority rights. In the Arab world, where do you think we're headed? Are we looking at something like Turkey? Are we looking at something with an even stronger clerical component in terms of the governments? What are your thoughts on where we'll be in 10, 20, 30 years?
Your crystal ball.
I think Turkey is a fair example, maybe for Egypt. If the army doesn't just go back and take power, we could be talking about a Turkish model where the army keeps certain rights, but kind of lets parliamentarian democracy emerge. Maybe that's a way to look at it. I think Syria might become a civil war pretty soon. That's my crystal ball.
I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think it varies from country to country. If you look at the most advanced case down the electoral road, which is Tunisia, they've already had, their election. We know that there's an Islamist party that won 40% of the vote. Many voices from within Nahda party in Tunisia have not hidden the fact that they do look at Turkey as a possible model. My sense is, and I hark back to the original point that Ahmed made, is that we are still in the early days of this thing. We don't know how it actually gonna pan out in the end. We don't know how long it's gonna take to pan out. One thing we know for sure from Tunisia, where it all started, and from Libya, is that an Islamist component is gonna become an inevitable part of the political configuration in the Middle East. How is that gonna play out in the future, 10, 15, 20 years down the road? Maybe, and it's interesting that in the case of Tunisia, they didn't give the Nahda party 50% or 60%. They gave them 40%, and they gave other parties that are sort of secular the rest of the vote. So I think people do acknowledge that the Islamists have a major role to play, but at least in the case of Tunisia, if you can extrapolate from that, they want to test them, see how they do. We Islamists, I think, were already tested in a place like Jordan in several years ago in municipal elections. So people want to test these movements, see whether they can actually respond to their concerns and aspirations before they make a final decision over the next 10, 15 years. But I think crucial to this debate is the issue, you mentioned minorities. I think one of the real tests of these revolutions, ultimately, in addition, obviously, to the overriding theme of this, which is freedom, but one of the most important tests is going to be how the issue of citizenship pans out. Because on the issue of citizenship ride a lot of other issues, the issues of women, the issues of minorities, and if ultimately some sort of political system emerges that takes the interests of all these things into account, then we're beginning to talk about revolution. Because I think it's too premature, in my humble opinion, to start talking about revolutions now. And it's interesting, if you look at the case of Libya, for example, forget about the killing of al-Qaddafi, because there are a lot of Arabs who feel that the way he was killed does not bode well for rule of law in the future of Libya. But just go back to before the regime fell, when things started happening in Libya, there were a lot of reports that al-Qaddafi was using mercenaries from sub-Saharan Africa. And what that meant, it meant an accentuation of racism in Libya, because all of a sudden, anybody who was black in Libya was considered suspect. The amazing thing is that in a place like Al-Fazan in Libya, a huge chunk of the indigenous Libyan population is black. So, it gives you an idea of the dynamics of the situation. I think that ultimately, if these revolutions do build political systems that take the interests of all sorts of people into account, then regardless of whether the model is the AK, the Islamists of Turkey or something else, But the main thing is that people want their economic concerns addressed, and then the issue of civil rights minorities have to be addressed before we can begin calling these revolutions. Because a revolution is about, it's a transformative process, in my eyes, more than the toppling of a regime. I think the toppling of a regime is the easier part.
Also,
Okay,
I
I'd
mean,
like to ask a quick question, if
sorry.
I might, and jump in on this. Considering all of the various triggering mechanisms that have led to the outbreak this past year, Al-Jazeera and others gave a lot of coverage to President Obama's Cairo speech. And I'm wondering if, in terms of causation, you can trace any of this back to the Cairo speech, in which he brought up issues of women's rights and others events that received intense coverage here in the United States. I know Al Jazeera covered it. I know social media covered it in China, though not the popular media or not the government media. Can you trace any causation?
And one might add, in the spirit of bipartisanship, that Condoleezza Rice in her new book is out on a speaking tour saying this was really all about President Bush's freedom agenda, and you can trace it back to that. So who has a thought about those two possibilities?
When Obama gave his Cairo speech, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about the speech at the time. And I thought it was really interesting that Obama was talking to the people and not to the leaders who were oppressing these people. Like his message was that, you deserve freedom, but who's denying us these freedoms? It's these dictators that your government is supporting and you've been allied with for a long time. So honestly, I don't think there is any direct relation between the Obama Cairo speech and what's happening in the Arab world now.
Do you two agree? Would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I could hardly see how,
I see it as, I see it like the scripture. You can interpret the scripture in so many different ways, whether you're talking about, the Bible or Quran, or you can interpret them in so many different ways. And therefore, an event like the speech of Obama, and whether it had something to do with what's going on in the Middle East now, you could argue both ways. Same thing for Bush, as you said, the freedom agenda. But here's the thing for the freedom agenda, and I'm saying this just as a gut feeling. I don't have anything to prove it. The sight of Saddam being pulled out of a rabbit hole in Iraq caused a lot of pain to a lot of Arabs who did not even necessarily agree with him, because they felt that it wasn't just Saddam that was humiliated then. They felt that it was a symbolism for the humiliation of the Arabs as a whole. But that particular event, in my eye, was illustrative of one very essential ingredient, which is that these dictators, when the chips are down, they cannot defend the nation against foreign aggression. They can only kill their own population. And my sense is that there's been a process of extrapolation from Saddam to Ben Ali to Egypt, and the impact may have been accumulative, because, as Ahmed said, ultimately they're seen by their populations as lackeys of the West, that they held the fort for the West, but they did not have the best interests of their own people at heart. But here's the thing, that's the whole thing about these revolutions, is that when you have the street moving, you basically give the West options, and that's what we've seen in Libya. The West went from supporting al-Qaddafi, bringing him back into the fold, but the popular momentum did force the West to make some choices. I don't know if those choices are just in words or in actions, but basically the narrative became, we are on the side of the people, we're not on the side of the dictators.
But more than one speech could possibly do while you're still giving out money to the same leaders.
Yes.
Another question. Is it time? No more questions in that case. If I might just say a final word of thanks to our panelists. I just feel we're extraordinarily lucky to have so much expertise, so much thoughtfulness. And I want to thank you all for coming on such a day. Thanks very much.